How should I do this? It's sort of like the Truman Show. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Since we've got the global community here, really have enjoyed kind of the first presentations, and there's a common theme that I'm also going to pick up on in all three actually, which is about transparency and asset tracking. I'm going to tie that into what I'm going to talk about here, as Scott said, so Richard Donaldson, I am one of the co-founders and lead platform development and marketing for a company called Requis. We are a new generation of supply chain platforms aimed at the enterprise space, enabling the enterprise supply chain teams to effectively do their buying, managing, and selling of assets on a platform. This has come out of my experience here in Silicon Valley. I'm in San Francisco. Been here since '97. Early career was banking and internet stuff at the beginning of the heyday. Middle of the career was in the big movement to build out web scale infrastructure, so data centers, networks, things of that nature. And that led me to ultimately take a job at eBay for 5 years, where I was thrown at, ran business operations for all the infrastructure there, which then exposed me to supply chain, which was a sort of new thing for me. And as I tend to do, started asking a few questions about how we manage things there and found out there was a lot of problems. Did stuff that ended up being very global as well too. So that led to the foundation of Requis. But all that is to say is that the commonality here, I think this is, I think not only in the emphasis here in zero waste, sustainability and circularity, that is clearly a key topic for everyone here, of course, but also for the world. But it ties inexorably to what we've begun to identify, not just us, but the world, is the importance of supply chains. And even before the COVID pandemic, I would contend, and I'm sure everyone here probably heard this directly or indirectly, is supply chains were starting to gain momentum as far as technology adoption and transformation. And so that was a big movement that was happening. And then COVID comes along, supply chains become top of mind for everything. And coming out of COVID, I'm going to say that this will be the decade of not only sustainability and circularity, but the decade of also supply chain transformation. So bit background there, Scott. As you know, if you wind me up real quick, I can get going very fast. So I didn't know if there's anything else you wanted to tee up before.
No, that's really it. I wanted to give your background because I really like it, and I think from the lens of corporate profits, sustainability, supply chain, the corporate view that we've spoken about before. I just really like the work that you're doing because it's going to make a huge difference with moving towards a circular economy. Yeah.
Cool. Mm-hmm. Well, let me tee things up by saying that if you were to pay attention to 15 seconds of my presentation, maybe a little bit longer, 30, these are the 3 key points that I would love for everyone to have. And I'll reiterate this in the 3 slides I'll come up with, which is that circularity is actually not just about the environment, but it's a profit first exercise for companies, especially companies. And in my lens, by the way, is I'm sort of assuming the consumer world has done an amazing job in both adopting technologies, interestingly enough, and also even advancing the world of recycling and circularity, as I actually was running out this morning to help my recycling trash and make sure that it was taken the right way. I think that's also something that's happened over the last couple of decades. So the consumers, I'm not talking much, but I'm actually talking from the lens of the enterprises and more specifically the Fortune 2000s or Global 2000s. But in talking to them about circularity, which is a key part of supply chain, I'll get into that in a second, really circularity is a pathway to sustainability. But instead of thinking about it as just an environmental kind of nice to have, it actually is, should be for CFOs, a profit first decision in margin improvement. That's point 1. Point 2 is that through the adoption of technologies and platforms specifically, I'll get to that in a second, and this ties to the theme that I heard across the 3 presentations, is that transparency and measurability is going to be the key attribute of technology, or key outcome of technology adoption and transformation, that's going to lead to, and I heard this in all 3 presentations, the desire to be able to see the assets or see the materials or see what's coming through the supply chain through technology and platform adoption in enterprises we'll begin to get to the place where in our consumer lives, I can see my toothbrush being delivered from start to finish, but in my enterprise life, I can't really see any of that. That's changing right now. And through that technology adoption transformation, that's where actually the things that everyone's been talking about so far today, and I'm sure will over time, it will bring forth the data, it will bring forth the asset information that you're looking for. And through that transparency, you will then be able to identify KPIs and begin to measure them. And I experienced this actually firsthand in the data center industry, where we invented a metric called PUE, or power utilization efficiency, or effectiveness. And that was the key kind of miles per gallon for data centers that really then accelerated the energy efficiency objectives of the data center world through that identification of a KPI, but then the measuring of it, and then the transparency around it. All those things kind of led to each other led the industry to really kind of go into hyperspeed in their pursuit of net neutral or zero waste kind of energy. And then third point in this is that the key to all of this, and this is put my sort of technology consulting hat on for a second, is the concept around digital twins. And this is the fundamental foundational technology component to making all these cool things happen. And digital twins very simply are exactly what they sound like. I'm sure everyone here is familiar. It's just the digital representation of, in my world, is the assets or your supply chain. That concept is really what will unlock a lot of the future technologies that we tend to talk or hear a lot about, like artificial intelligence or machine learning, or even arguably, not as much relevant, but blockchain. Those tend to be kind of the top of mind when you hear people talk tech. And I'm actually a tech guy. I don't like to talk about those because they're in the future. There's very fundamental elements around digital twins, putting together technologies that allow you to see the supply chain from start to finish, that will need to happen first to get to those places. So with that, let me just jump right in. And this is probably the one marquee slide that we've developed that I think really tells this whole story in totality. So this slide alone is we'll call this the annual aggregate global supply chain. This is the top 2,000 companies in the world. This ties to, and there was a presentation earlier talking about the raw materials coming out, but 4 numbers in here I always like to talk about, which is the 47 gigatons of raw materials that are extracted out of the earth that feed the 12 trillion of procurement that the Global 2000 spends per year, $12 trillion. Those same 2,000 companies are sitting on an aggregate asset base worth over $189 trillion. And let me preface this or make the point here, that's book value, meaning the depreciated value of those assets. It's not market value. Why that's important is I think you can get a 20, 30, 40% premium if you actually looked at this as after market value of just these assets, just a little data point to keep in the back of your head. And if we're doing disposition properly of these assets on an annual basis, whether it's used, surplus, or excess, you can pick a percentage ratio of these 189, 2, 3, 4, 5%. I just picked 2 for giggles. But that 3 trillion of disposition, that's the real economic impact. That money, and this is why I go back to circularity being a profit first decision, just by actively managing the disposition process of your assets, all of this money is free cash. It's 100% margin that can be plowed back into the business that sells it. And then those assets, which have a lot of life in them still, if they're not recycled, which is also a good way to do it, can be fed back into the supply chain. Here's your circularity, and avoid the need for raw materials and augment what you're purchasing in here. Now, just one clarification, and I know I got a bunch of experts on here, so I want to make sure I got the data right. This 47 gigatons is actually the amount of raw materials pulled out of the earth, according to the UN, is 90 gigatons per year. 43 of that is for food, which I discluded for this framework. And this just represents then the actual raw materials used to produce things. Now, is it exact one-to-one? It's not. But the idea here is to create a framework to enable the conversation in a simple way so that we can set objectives both as a world, as an aggregate supply chain, but then also you can double click into this and use the same framework for industries, or as we're getting to, a lot of people are talking about here, is triple click into this and use this for companies, right? So this is a really easy way to see and begin to measure companies' impacts on circularity and even profitability through kind of beginning to create 4 KPIs that they measure, and we all kind of agree to, and how to measure it and kind of put it out there could create an interesting scorecard. So this one I could spend an entire day on, and I'm sure there are going to be some questions. I know time, I want to be conscious of that as well too. So I'm just going to flip into the next slide. Now, point number 2 that I wanted to bring up today was also the idea around what it means in this technology digital transformation. And the key point that I would throw out here for everybody is that the world of technology is going to and is running on platforms. Right, so the idea of discrete software or own software, although sometimes seems like a almost self-evident concept to say, it is not in all circles. There's still a lot of the enterprise that's running on legacy applications. I would consider SAP to be legacy. That's probably a bit controversial out there, but it is. It will be, in my opinion, it will be displaced over the next decade here. But it's going to join the ranks of HP and IBM, which are kind of moving into obsolescence. But platforms, and there's a great book called Platform Revolution written by a guy named Jeff Parker. If you want to learn more about it, it's kind of like the Crossing the Chasm kind of book, but really talks about the platforms, platform economy. And these are things that we all know, whether Amazon is a platform, Alibaba is a platform, Salesforce is a platform. But in the world of supply chain, there are not platforms. They're coming, they're happening. Requis happens to be one of probably what I consider to be a bunch that are showing up. And the point that I'm actually putting up here is just to emphasize this is Gartner just started a new Magic Quadrant where historically Gartner used to track these 4 categories as discrete software: procurement, source to pay solutions. This is your Ariba, Coupa, whatever, marketplaces, vendor supplier management, even enterprise asset management. Now, what we're seeing, though, is the rise of Gartner's new category, and it's an awful name. They'll change it. It's called Multi-Enterprise Supply Chain Business Networks, which is a tongue twister to really get you to the place of saying platforms. And these are supply chain platforms. I think it'll be recast that in time. And these supply chain platforms, not surprisingly, contain what it takes for a supply chain team to run itself, to buy things, to manage things, suppliers and assets, and even the assets themselves. So that's a trend that you're going to see happening. I think platforms are here, and you're going to see all enterprises convert themselves to probably one of 4, 5, 6 platforms to run the whole business. That transformation is happening, and you'll see more of that coming. Last but not least is the concept of digital twins, and I specifically focus on assets. And this has been something that has been a key element from the start of when I began to build this. Because one of the things I found when I first started at eBay in my role, which led me to start building this stuff, was the first question I asked my team at the time was, how many routers do we own and where are they? Now, this is at a high-tech company, bear in mind. It took me 6 months to get that question. That was when the light bulb started to go off a little bit for me, that there was some issues here. And so what I found very quickly is that the key element from our vantage point in managing supply chains, and this is where I tie back to the other presentations from today, is tracking the assets as they move through the system. If there's one element around technology or digital transformation that all people need to keep in mind in the world of supply chain, and even in circularity and sustainability, because they'll be beneficiaries of tracking this data and these assets, is creating a digital representation of your assets as they come from raw materials through the manufacturing process to when they're first purchased to then, and all the while you're creating data around that asset as you track it, right? So creating almost like a Carfax-like record around that asset. That then enables the asset to move with the least amount of friction through the global supply chain. So again, from raw materials to manufacturing to ultimately the first owner who then uses it, tracks the maintenance, again, just like a Carfax, so that the next person, whether it's a recycler or a broker or another end user, or as we're also seeing a lot of OEMs who are waking up to ideas of circularity, but more important, profitability, are dipping back into repurchasing of their equipment, just like Mercedes has popularized the pre-certified owned car, or seeing these large OEMs understand that they can go back in, repurchase product, and basically double dip, resell it again in a refurbished capacity, and open up their markets to larger audiences. So
that's interesting. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I want to keep it kind of conversational, but I saw a really good video this morning in the Netherlands of disassembly of major equipment. And it was a manufacturer, and they were taking big industrial equipment and they were disassembling it, and then they were selling it to another manufacturer, and it was at a fraction of the cost of new equipment. And these things are happening, but the repairs, the repurpose, the reassembling, they were talking about the monetary benefit of that and the component to the circular economy. And they may be 5 to 10 years ahead of us. I'm kind of fascinated to watch these videos of what's happening in Europe. You know, and from your lens, I'd love to see like what you think it would take to accelerate that movement in the US, you know? Yeah.
Well, and I think it's, again, it's going to be a show and tell kind of thing, Scott. I think you pick up a great point. The more we're visible with examples of that, both in not only how it's done, but more importantly, what you just said, you know, the money that can be made, you know, don't get me wrong. I'm sure it's not controversial for everybody here, but at the end of the day, it's okay to want to be an environmentalist and to want to make money.
Yes.
They're not, they're not mutually exclusive. You don't have to choose one or the other. And you're talking to someone who lives in the middle of the Bay Area. I know Daniel's down south of me in Santa Cruz or whatever. But even us NorCal, you know, hippy dippy types, we also can want to make money too. It's an okay thing. So you don't have to treat you know, environmental best practices as somehow anathema to the idea of profitability. So I think that's also something that's going to start coming out more and more.
When Alan had a quick question, Alan Witters.
Sure.
Alan, are you there? Oh, maybe he's on mute. Yeah, he had a quick question about, let me see. Hold on a moment, sorry.
No worries.
I think Alan had a question. I'm just trying to find it here.
Does
anyone see Alan's question? Yeah.
It looks like there's a handful.
How do you cross the internal value chain to external value chain chasm?
I'm going to try to interpret that question. I don't know if they're on there, and I'm going to do the best that I can. So, so good question. And if I understand it correctly, so the internal supply chain connected to the external supply chain, I think is sort of the essence of the question. And my answer to that is, that's where platforms come in to make that connectivity, right? So if you think about Amazon or Alibaba as platforms, they, in essence, have connected both the internal consumer supply chain with the external supply chains themselves. It's the same thing that's going to happen in the enterprise supply chain, where companies, enterprises are going to jump on to a platform like Requis, or SAP's got Ariba, which is sort of kind of close. E2Open, there's a handful of others, and there's a bunch of others that are going to show up. But the idea here is that I'll use Requis as an example, but our core enterprises are what we call operators. Doesn't matter the vertical, and then they're joined up by their suppliers, and they're what we call surplus buyers, which is kind of treat the three types of companies or personas. If they're all on the same platform, then that's where we connect the external and internal, or make one seamless supply chain, where really at the end of the day, what are we doing? We're actually tracking the assets. And this is the other part that again, if I were to, and it's the common theme in here, is if we want to see, manage, improve, drive circularity, well, what we need to aim ourselves at, which is kind of the hardest part of this, is tracking the assets themselves, making the digital twins of those assets. That then allows us to watch as raw materials get moved into manufacturing, that then gets converted into a product, which then gets bought and used, which then gets used again and again till it's disassembled, recycled, and put back into the supply chain. It sounds simple, It looks simple even from a chart like this, but to get there is going to take a lot of work. This involves things like Internet of Things, digitally enabling the tracking of the assets themselves. And you can still see this. You can see this in a lot of different sectors. So aviation, airplanes have had this capability for a long time. The autonomous vehicles, if we look at the current vehicles like a Tesla today, if you think about it, that car actually has all the technology built into it to not only track every piece of itself, right, and report on itself, but, and this is going to sound a little bit futuristic, but it's there, it can actually get itself repaired, right? So now think of your Tesla or car enabled like that. It actually knows when it needs some fix. It could drive itself to the service station, get fixed, and drive it back without you even being there, right? So that technology exists today. And again, let me stop, Scott, because if you keep me going, I can keep going for a long time. So I want to get other questions. I may have lost you, Scott. I'm going to open up.
That's on mute.
Okay, yeah, he's on mute. No worries. I just sort of jumped into the questions here to see if I can see anything.
You're muted, Scott.
Scott, you're still muted.
Yeah. So I think one of the last questions there, I'll get on that as Scott's getting himself figured out, is how do you do that with existing systems or existing assets or existing stuff? The short answer is there is no easy way.
Sorry
I
about
wish
that.
there was a magic solution, but there just isn't. It's going to be a bit of retrofit. And then there's also going to be the idea of just obsolescence happening, right? So just imagine, cars today that, have form factors where you actually have to use a key to start the car. That seems a bit archaic in some respect, but those are going to get phased out over time. So same thing's going to happen in the world of digitization, digital twins and assets.